We have Assassin's Creed Mirage coming on October 5th to consoles and PC. And this we got this PC features trailer, which gives us some details. It also gives us a full system requirement list. I guess not in this trailer, but that's there. And it also tells us something interesting about the sponsorship of the game. They are partnering with Intel for their their game partnership, right? A lot of games will partner with AMD or NVIDIA. This one is Intel, so we are seeing that they're focusing on Intel's XeSS upscaling technology. And the assumption here might be that means that we will not see AMD's FSR or NVIDIA's DLSS, and if that is indeed the case, I think that's a shame. AMD has been criticized heavily recently for some of their sponsored games not coming with DLSS and just with FSR. Starfield was the biggest focus of a lot of that backlash, and now we do see Starfield announcing that it will support DLSS in a coming update. Whether or not AMD was falsely accused, or whether or not, in other words, them actually blocking the competitors' upscaling technologies and maybe they backed off due to backlash, or maybe it wasn't happening at all. The point is that it's very clear that PC gamers, on the whole, you know, the majority of them, would rather all of the major upscaling technologies be implemented in the games, and it does not gain you a marketing win to restrict the implementation of the other competing technologies into a game. That objectively makes the game worse than if it had all of those options so that people can choose the one that they prefer or works best on their hardware. So I will just say that if this game does come out and only have XeSS, I am not a huge fan of that. Anyway, they do have some other little compatibility, like haptic things and whatnot for lighting and all of that, but the prime focus of this video is going to be whether or not your PC can run the game. And hey, the good news is if these system requirements end up being true, it looks like your PC can likely run the game. Now, my understanding is that Assassin's Creed Mirage is not, and I shouldn't just say my understanding, it's definitely going to run on older gen consoles, meaning this is not a next gen only, or I should say current gen only title, which means that it should scale back to older PCs a lot easier as well than what we've seen with the latest games that don't have backwards compatibility to older consoles. Again, system requirements charts are not always perfect, but at least looking at this, it seems pretty reasonable. So let's kind of go in by performance tier. Also, I really like that they actually put out the type of system requirement chart that I really think should just be the standard for a AAA release on PC these days, and let's definitely give them credit for that. It shows you not just, here's some hardware that can probably run the game, but it tells you how it will run the game. Again, the accuracy of these claims have yet to be verified when the game launches. But if you want to play at 1080p, low settings at 30 frames per second, you're going to want a GPU around the ballpark of an Intel Arc A380, a GTX 1066GB, or a Radeon RX 570. We've also got some CPUs thrown into the mix here, which I'll talk more about in just a second, and we also have RAM at 8GB of RAM. A lot of games nowadays saying 16 for the minimum, and this one still only being down at 8. Also, the game's install size at 40GB is a lot more reasonable than some recent games we've seen that are pushing that 100GB or more category. Anyway, let's hop into the CPUs here. I think the most interesting thing to note on these CPUs is just that if you are using an Intel Arc GPU, they pretty much require resizable bar support to work well, which is why if you're using an Intel Arc GPU, it's requiring a much newer processor with the i5-8400, because starting with, I believe, that generation of processor and motherboard, you can generally get a BIOS update to allow enabling resizable bar. And if you do that, and again, you might need to actually update your BIOS to be able to do that, but if you do that, then they're saying it should run okay on the Intel Arc GPUs, so that's why we have this in there, if you were confused. Anyway, With that in mind, though, the other CPUs here don't seem anything too crazy. The Intel i7-4790K is at this, well, I mean, well, it was extremely high-end when it first came out. If we hop over here and take a look at this, it's only a 4-core processor. It does hyper-thread up to 8 threads, but this thing released way back in 2014. So that is 9 years old at this point. So they're saying that a 9-year-old 4-core 8-thread processor, so a high-end but 9-year-old CPU, should at least be able to get you 30 frames per second in the game. If we're looking at the AMD side of things, they're saying the Ryzen 5 1600, which is a much newer processor, but still many generations ago, 6-core 12-thread, and this one coming from 2017, so still about 6 years old at this point, and it's just the mid-range chip from 6 years ago. So again, not asking for anything too crazy there. If we look at the GPU side of things, and you're like, well, I don't have one of these particular GPUs, I'll link this tool in my video description. This is Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart. I find it to be, well, it's not perfectly accurate, especially for individual games. It's a little better in terms of just overall gaming average performance, which is more what it's designed for. What this gives you is the ability to find your GPU, click on it, like maybe you have a GTX 1060, and then it sets that performance as a baseline of 100%. And then you can see how other GPUs scale relatively to that, how much percent faster or slower they are relative to the GPU that you've clicked on. The reason that's useful for people looking at system requirements charts who don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of every GPU and how they perform relatively to each other generally, and again, this chart is not perfect, and especially for individual games, sometimes things can vary pretty wildly. If we click on the A380, for example, or actually right now we're set at the 1060, if we scroll back a bit, again, you might find your GPU relative to this, but here we find the Intel Arc A380. If I set that as a baseline, we're basically looking at cards like if you have a GTX 1650, that might offer you similar performance. Does that make sense? Now, this doesn't always take into account things like the VRAM amount, and if you need a certain amount to run the game, things like that. So there is certainly more to it than that. But then if we compare it to the other cards listed here, the RX 470 is generally within about 10% of the performance. And so, but again, we're looking at the RX 570 here, so let's actually jump up to that. So that's within about 17% of the performance. So again, nothing too crazy different there, although if we do scroll up, again, you might find your GPU on the list. Maybe you have a 970 still. That's actually generally more powerful than the A380 that they're recommending here, and not too, also in a similar ballpark to the RX 570. And then if we scroll up to the GTX 1060, that is a bit more powerful than the other ones we were seeing on the list, and this one's at usually about 32% more powerful we're seeing here versus the A380. Again, general ballpark figures. But again, you might find your GPU kind of on this list. Maybe you have an RX 6500 XT. Well, that's similar in performance to that GTX 1060, that type of thing. So that's how to read that list and see if you fall into roughly a 1080p low 30 FPS experience. But what if you wanted to play the game at 60 frames per second at 1080p at high settings? Notice that they are bumping up the CPU workload. Now, if you're going from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second, that makes sense. And while many settings in games don't have a large impact on CPU performance, some do. There might be crowd density settings, certain things are still calculated on the CPU with other graphic settings as well. It does make sense that you would want to jump up to a more powerful CPU. On the CPU side of things, now they're jumping up to an i7 8700K or a Ryzen 5 3600. So definitely newer CPUs here. If we want to look at roughly what we're looking at there, the 8700K is a 6-core 12-thread high-end CPU, but from 2017. So we're still looking back about 6 years at this point. And the Ryzen 5 3600, this is a couple generations newer than the Ryzen 5 1600 we saw for the minimum 30 FPS range. And this is a 2019 CPU, kind of mid-range CPU, 6-core 12-thread. So if you're somewhere in that ballpark, it looks like they're claiming you should be able to get 60 frames per second in the game. Of course, that rarely means that you can't find a place where you'll dip below that, but there we go. If we go ahead and take a look at the GPU side of things, they're jumping up to an Intel Arc A750, a 1660 Ti from NVIDIA, or an RX 5600 XT. If we keep the A380 as the baseline and scroll up, again, you might find your GPU on this list as we scroll. These are, going to be more powerful. Here we find the 1660 Ti, which is like a 78% performance uplift according to this chart from the A380. So that does seem to fall in line to roughly a jump from if you're around 30 to around 60. Again, these are rarely a hard saying like you're getting exactly 30 here, you're getting exactly 60 here, right? It's more of a ballpark. So a ballpark of almost doubling performance to jump to the 60 FPS, also with some settings turned up, seems somewhat reasonable here. The 5600 XT is also kind of in this general ballpark, although generally a bit stronger than your 1660 Ti. This one is showing an actual doubling of the performance of the A380, at least according to this chart. And then, again, they were going up to the Arc A750 for their actual listed GPU. But remember, they have the partnership with Intel, and Intel doesn't have as wide a range of GPUs in the market in general. They don't really have anything in between the A380 and the A750. So I would say that this is more of kind of a placeholder because that's what they had to put here. So it makes sense that the other ones are probably more like the actual performance level you would need, where the 5600 XT and the 1660 Ti, again, a bit weaker than the A750 often, but I would guess that this is more like the performance level to get, and then the A750 was just the closest Intel match. And with the Intel partnership, that's probably why they're talking about that. So again, if you have something like a GTX 1070, that's usually pretty similar to the 1660 Ti. The RTX 3050 is right around there as well. So you can get an idea of where your GPU would fall in comparison. Let's go ahead and scroll over there. What if you're playing at 1440p resolution, high settings, 60 frames per second? Now, the one thing I'll mention here is increasing the CPU requirement does not make a lot of sense. Because generally increasing resolution does not increase the workload on the CPU, it increases the workload on the GPU. But also notice they're not doing much. The 8700K and the 9700K, there's not a lot of difference between them. And the Ryzen 5 3600 and then the Ryzen 7 3700X, it's within the same generation, very similar gaming performance. Yes, you get some more cores. Specifically, the 9700K is an 8-core, 8-thread CPU from 2018, and the Ryzen 7 3700X is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU from 2019 from AMD. But I don't think there's a lot in that jump. It's probably more like what was just in their test systems. They just had a slightly higher end CPU in the test systems there. Maybe having the extra cores will smooth out performance a little bit. Who knows? Now, the GPUs are, once again, jumping to your next Intel tier, right? The Arc A770, but then, which Intel doesn't offer anything in between. And honestly, in most games, there's not a large performance difference between these two. They are specifying the 8 gigabyte version of the A770 should be fine, although there is a 16 gigabyte version on the market. And then they're going up to the NVIDIA RTX 2070 or the AMD 5700 XT. Again, if we look at where your GPU might fall as we scroll around between those, if I go from a 1660 Ti, you can find a bunch of GPUs that we're kind of scrolling through here on the side until we get to the 2070. So we're only going with a 34% performance bump between the 1660 Ti and the RTX 2070, and we do see the 5700 XT falling in generally very similar performance to that RTX 2070. Again, in individual games, it can vary, and actually this time around, the Arc A750 is actually pretty close to the performance numbers that we're seeing on these recommended GPUs, but they're jumping to the A770, maybe just to throw it in here. But again, there's generally not a large performance difference, especially on the 8 gigabyte version for the 770 versus the A750. All these GPUs are right in this general ballpark, so there's not a whole lot to talk about there, really. Anyway, we also have the 4K specs. And notice that the CPU is increasing here. Now, we are going from high settings to ultra settings, and it is possible that some of those settings will have an increased CPU burden. Maybe you're getting more crowds within the cities, things like that. So the CPU requirement is jumping to an 11600K or a Ryzen 5 5600X. These are definitely newer and more powerful CPUs. The 11600K 6-core 12-thread CPU from 2021, generally not that much more performant than a 10600K, but is going to be a little more performant in games than your 9 series that we saw recommended before that. And the 5600 is certainly more gaming performance than the 3600 or 3700X that we were seeing previously. 6-core 12-thread CPU, and this one from 2022. So we're certainly moving up there. Whether that's actually necessary for the ultra settings, it's certainly not going to really matter for going from 1440p to 4K. Because generally, like I said, that increases the burden on the GPU, not on the CPU. Let's look at the GPUs they're recommending here. Notice there is no Intel Arc GPU recommended for 4K Ultra 60 FPS because the A770 is currently as good as it gets. So now we're just seeing some AMD and NVIDIA recommendations. They're saying the RTX 3080 or the 6900 XT should be fine. If we scroll up our list from the, if we set our A770 as our baseline, this was 1440p high settings. And now we want to scroll up, you can find, okay, maybe you're getting higher frame rate or maybe turning up the, the settings to ultra, that kind of thing. Then we get to the 3080, generally a large performance bump, about 76% according to this particular chart. And now if I set this as the baseline, the 6900 XT is at 4K resolution. And some people might not realize this, but the in the 3000 versus 6000 series lineup, the 3000 series NVIDIA GPUs generally scaled better at the higher resolutions relatively to the lower resolutions. So honestly, pairing a 6900 XT versus a 3080 is not super far off, although generally the 6800 XT is a closer match. But again, it can vary by game, and at the 4K resolution, generally does tend to favor a little more towards, a few percent difference towards the 3080. And honestly, the 6800 XT and 6900 XT don't have that wide of a performance gap anyway. So I have a feeling you'd kind of be fine there. If you're thinking about the newer GPUs, if you're something on like an RTX 4070 or a 7800 XT, this is a similar performance class. So you would expect to get, again, pretty good here. And again, compared to a lot of other games that have come out recently, which are, honestly not even running at 60 frames per second on an RTX 4090 at native 4K max settings, which we have seen in some recent games, this certainly looks a lot more reasonable. In general, this system requirements list does look a lot more like what we saw a few years ago before we started getting as many of these next-gen, current-gen only console exclusive games. So it honestly looks pretty scalable. Whether that means the graphics will blow us away or not, remains to be seen, that kind of thing. And like I said, I'm hoping that this doesn't mean, that the Intel XeSS is not the only upscaling technology available in the game. Again, if there is going to be exclusivity on the upscaling technology, it is better for it to be either XeSS or FSR than for it to be DLSS, because these at least do run on all hardware. You can use this on AMD and NVIDIA hardware. Whereas DLSS, that wouldn't be the case. So if it is going to be exclusive to one, I'd rather it be one of the open versions. However, again, if you're making these games support one of these technologies, they all basically take the same input data from the game engine. So once you have it running on one of them, it should be able to run on the others. We've seen this, for example, with Starfield getting a DLSS mod literally day one of launch from modders. So if modders can do that, even if it's not a perfect implementation, you would hope that a AAA game developer could manage the same thing. Anyway, and I do really feel strongly that that should be the standard. Again, in general, AMD, it's not AMD, but Ubisoft is saying that they are going to be supporting, wide, the general PC hardware stuff, unlocked frame rates, 4K, simultaneously using a keyboard and mouse with a controller or other inputs, which is nice to see. And let's see, I think we had, again, some tie-in with some lighting products and haptic feedbacks and whatnot. I believe ultra-wide resolutions, all of that. HDR support, which shouldn't need to be highlighted, but again, it's games like Starfield. Anyway, What do you guys think about this? Are you interested in the game? It is one that I perhaps could test out on the channel if you're interested. It shouldn't be too hard, as there is actually an in-game benchmark for performance analysis announced. So there is that, and again, widescreen support and all of that. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.